Open your paycheck. The number at the top looks bigger than it did 5 years ago, bigger than it did 10 years ago. On paper, you got a raise, multiple raises actually. So why does it feel like you have less? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Your salary probably has gone up and you're still falling behind. Both of those things are true at the same time. And today we're going to break down exactly why, because the gap between your number went up and your life got better might be the single most quietly misleading thing in modern economics. Let's start with the trick almost nobody explains clearly enough. There are two totally different things hiding inside the word salary. There's your nominal wage, the actual number printed on your paycheck, and there's your real wage, what that number can actually buy after accounting for rising prices. Your nominal wage almost always goes up. Companies give raises, minimum wages get adjusted, cost of living bumps happen every year or two. But your real wage, the thing that actually determines whether you can afford more, the same or less than you could before, depends entirely on whether your raise outran inflation or lost to it. And for a huge portion of workers, especially over the last several years, raises have been quietly losing that race. Picture it like a treadmill. Every year, prices move the belt forward. Your raise is how fast you're running. If you run faster than the belt moves, you actually gain ground. That's real wage growth. If you run at exactly the same speed as the belt, you're sprinting in place, working just as hard, going absolutely nowhere. And if you run slower than the belt moves, you're actually sliding backward, even though from your own perspective, it still looks like you're running forward the whole time. You're breathing hard, you're moving your legs, you just haven't gone anywhere. That treadmill effect is exactly why a bigger number on your paycheck can quietly coexist with a smaller amount of stuff you can actually afford. Now, let's talk about why this keeps happening, because there are several forces working against you at once, and almost none of them show up in a headline that says, wages rise 4% this year. First, the raise you get is backward looking, while the prices you pay are moving forward in real time. Most companies set annual raises based on the previous year's inflation, previous year's performance, previous year's budget. That means your raise is essentially trying to catch up to a target that already moved by the time you receive it. If inflation accelerated during the year your raise was being calculated, you're chasing a number that's already out of date the moment it lands in your bank account. You're always fighting last year's war with this year's paycheck. Second, average wage statistics hide enormous variation underneath a single comforting number. When you hear average wages rose 4% this year, that average is being pulled upward by a relatively small number of high earners in high growth industries, tech, finance, specialized fields, getting large raises, while a much bigger group of workers in retail, hospitality, administrative work, and other lower wage sectors are getting far smaller increases, sometimes barely above zero in real terms. The average sounds healthy. The median, the raise a typical worker is actually experiencing, often tells a much less flattering story. And almost nobody in the news is reporting the median. They're reporting the average because it's the more optimistic number, and optimistic numbers get more clicks than accurate ones. Third, and this one is genuinely sneaky, the categories where prices are rising fastest tend to be exactly the categories you can't avoid spending money on. Housing, healthcare, childcare, education. These aren't optional purchases you can simply skip if they get too expensive. Nobody says, you know what, I'll just stop needing a place to live this year. They're recurring, unavoidable, and in most cases growing faster than general inflation and dramatically faster than wages in the same sectors. So even when overall inflation looks moderate on the news, the specific things eating the largest share of your monthly budget can be quietly outpacing your paycheck year after year, while the official inflation number stays looking calm because it's being averaged against things like electronics and clothing, which have gotten cheaper. This connects to something worth sitting with for a second: the difference between the average inflation number and your personal inflation number. If your personal spending is heavily weighted toward the fastest rising categories and light on the categories that got cheaper, your actual cost of living can be rising significantly faster than the headline number the entire time, no matter what the news anchor says with a reassuring smile. Now, here's a factor that almost never gets discussed honestly. Bargaining power has shifted dramatically over the last several decades, and it hasn't shifted in your favor. 50 years ago, a much larger share of the workforce belonged to unions, which gave workers collective leverage to negotiate wages that actually kept pace with or exceeded inflation and productivity growth. As union membership declined sharply across most industries, that collective leverage declined right along with it. Individual workers negotiating alone, one at a time, against an employer with far more information, far more resources, and far more patience, tend to lose that negotiation more often than they win it. This isn't a moral judgment on any particular company. It's simply what happens to bargaining leverage when negotiating power becomes concentrated almost entirely on one side of the table. At the same time, something strange happened to the relationship between productivity and pay. For decades after World War II, worker productivity and worker compensation rose together, almost in lockstep, like two dancers moving to the same song. As workers produced more value per hour, their pay rose to reflect it. Starting in the 1970s, that relationship began to quietly break apart. Productivity kept climbing. Compensation, adjusted for inflation, grew far more slowly, and in some periods, barely moved at all. That gap between how much more value workers are creating and how much more they're actually being paid for creating it hasn't closed since. If anything, it's widened, which raises an uncomfortable question that almost never gets asked out loud in polite company. If workers are producing significantly more value than they used to, and getting paid only marginally more for it, where exactly is that extra value going? The honest answer is complicated, but a meaningful part of it flows toward corporate profits, shareholder returns, and executive compensation, all of which have grown dramatically faster than typical worker pay over the same period. This isn't some hidden conspiracy meeting in a back room. It's simply where the money flows when bargaining power sits overwhelmingly on one side of a negotiation, quarter after quarter, year after year. There's also a quieter mechanism working in the background: globalization and automation, both of which put continuous downward pressure on wages for a huge range of jobs, particularly ones that can be automated, offshored, or replaced with cheaper labor elsewhere. This doesn't mean every job is at risk or that these forces are purely negative. Global trade and automation have made plenty of goods genuinely cheaper, and that matters too. But for a specific band of the workforce, mostly in manufacturing, clerical work, and increasingly customer-facing roles, the constant background threat of "we could replace this position more cheaply" has kept wage growth suppressed for years, even during periods when a company's profits were rising comfortably. You don't need to actually replace someone to suppress their wages. You just need them to know you could. Now let's talk about something particularly relevant right now: the difference between what a raise looks like on paper and what a raise actually feels like when housing costs are the elephant sitting quietly in the room. Housing has become the single largest, most stubborn expense pulling against wage growth for millions of people. In many major cities, rent and home prices have risen dramatically faster than local wages for years running. This means that even a genuinely solid raise, one that technically outpaces general inflation on paper, can still leave someone feeling like they're falling behind, because the category eating the largest share of their paycheck is rising even faster than their raise. A 5% raise feels meaningless if your rent went up 12%. The math on paper says you got ahead. The math in your actual bank account at the end of the month says something completely different. And here's the part that makes all of this so hard to talk about honestly. None of these forces show up cleanly in a single statistic. There's no headline that reads, "Your specific combination of industry, city, and spending habits means your real wage actually fell 3% this year, even though the national average rose." That number exists for you personally somewhere, but nobody's reporting it because it's different for every single person, and averages don't do nuance. So where does this leave things? Your salary probably has gone up. That part is genuinely true almost across the board. But your salary went up and your standard of living improved are two completely different claims, and the gap between them has been quietly widening for decades, hidden behind optimistic headlines, misleading averages, and a treadmill of rising costs that moves just as fast or faster than most people's raises. None of this means wage growth is fake or meaningless. Real wage growth absolutely happens for real people, in real years, in real industries. But it's far less universal, far less automatic, and far more fragile than the cheerful phrase, "you got a raise," makes it sound. Understanding the difference between a nominal raise and a real raise, between an average statistic and a median experience, between headline inflation and your own personal cost of living, is the difference between actually understanding your financial situation and simply feeling vaguely confused about why a bigger number doesn't seem to be buying you a bigger life. Your paycheck isn't lying to you, it's just telling you a much smaller part of the story than most people ever bother to ask about.